What's up, everybody? My name's Adam McDormand, and this is American Literature. Now, the next story that you're going to read for my class is a fantastic short story by William Faulkner called A Rose for Emily. Now, really, in order to get the most out of this text, I think it's helpful to know a little bit about the author himself, a little bit about the historical context surrounding this story, as well as some of the key literary elements that William Faulkner uses to weave together this really engaging narrative. So I put together a little presentation. Now, William Faulkner lived from 1897 to 1962. He grew up in Lafayette County, Mississippi, in the deep, deep South. He never actually finished high school, but was avid in his self-study of history. Now, if anything, that should be an encouragement to those of you for whom school is not your thing. Like, it wasn't his thing either, and he went on to not just win awards, but to be regarded as one of the most important authors in all of American literature. He wrote his first novel called Soldier's Pay in 1926 while he was actually living in New Orleans. And he moved home shortly after that to focus on his writing exclusively. Many of Faulkner's novels and short stories actually take place in a kind of fictionalized version of his home called Yoknapatawpha County, which is a mouthful. Now, he drew a lot of inspiration from the people that he was around, the city that he grew up in, just the history and storytelling of the place where he grew up in the South. A lot of these narratives often dealt with the tension between tradition and progress. Now, if you can imagine the South post-Civil War, contending with the way that America's changing rapidly, both economically and culturally, during the time of the Industrial Revolution, a lot of Southerners just weren't crazy about the North. They weren't crazy about the culture. They really just wanted things to be the way they'd always been. They wanted to go back to the South being the way it was. And a lot of Faulkner's approach to storytelling was experimental. In fact, he became known for stories that had multiple different points of view, stories that were told out of order. We'll get into that a little bit when we talk about how A Rose for Emily comes together. Now, a few of these notable works include The Sound and the Fury, which was published in 1929, As I Lay Dying, which was published in 1930, Life in August from 1932, and Absalom, Absalom in 1936. William Faulkner won the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1949. And actually, I want to take a look at part of his Nobel Prize acceptance speech, which you'll see on the slide in front of you. In part of it, he says that our tragedy today is a general and universal physical fear, so long sustained by now that we can even bear it. There are no longer problems of the spirit. There is only the question, when will I be blown up? Because of this, the young man or woman writing today has forgotten the problems of the human heart in conflict with itself, which alone can make good writing, because only that is worth writing about, worth the agony and the sweat. He must learn them again. He must teach himself that the basest of all things is to be afraid, and teach himself that, forget it forever, leaving no room in his workshop for anything but the old verities and truth of the heart, the old universal truths, lacking which any story is ephemeral and doomed, love and honor and pity and pride and compassion and sacrifice. I think in this speech he touches on some things that are still true for us. At the beginning of this excerpt, he mentions a kind of existential fear, and that's a thing that is so much a part of our culture nowadays. We're afraid of a lot of things. We find ourselves filled with anxiety, with dread, with depression, and that can begin to become a distraction for us from what is really important, the good, the true, the beautiful, these big ideas, these important concepts that he thinks are the only thing that's worth writing about. And if you think about it, the greatest works of literature are the ones that shed light on this deep universal truth about the human heart in conflict with itself. These big ideas of love and honor, pity, pride, compassion, sacrifice, the things that we find virtuous, the things that we think we should embody in our own lives. Not only do I think that's really fascinating, but I think he makes a good point for us engaging deeply with literature and looking for these truths in the greatest storytellers, in the greatest stories that we can read. Now let's talk a little bit about A Rose for Emily itself. This story was published in 1930. It focuses on this really mysterious character, this old woman named Miss Emily Grierson. And like I said, it takes place in Jefferson, Mississippi, in this fictional Yoknapatawpha County, probably somewhere before 1890 all the way up to about 1930. Now, as I mentioned before, the cultural context of the time, many of the Southerners are still kind of bitter about losing the Civil War. They're holding on to this old version of the South, and really that's kind of at the heart of who Emily Grierson is as a character. There are a couple of pieces of information that you kind of need to have on your radar as you're reading this story. At one point, there are some characters that sprinkle lime in Miss Emily's yard. Now, we're not talking about like the citrus fruit. They're not making margaritas in the front yard. The lime that they're referring to is actually a powdered substance, probably something like calcium hydroxide, that's used for a lot of different things, but one of which, and the thing that's important for the story, is that it's used to cover odors. Another thing that you need to be aware of is the fact that, unfortunately, this story does include some use of the N-word. Now, I've edited that out of the version that you're reading, so you don't have to engage with it, but just know that, that was an acceptable term at the time. Obviously, nowadays we think of that word as something deplorable, something we know better than to say, or I hope we do. But just know that that's in there. Some really important literary features of this story. First and foremost, the title of the story is symbolic. It's called A Rose for Emily. What that symbolism is and what it means is open to a pretty wide array of interpretations, but it is not a literal thing. It's not a story about flowers, if you will. Also, the story is told in 5 parts, and it's a non-linear narrative, which means that the events of the story are not told in chronological order. They're not told in the order that they happen. You can think back to an occurrence at Owl Creek Bridge by Ambrose Bierce. That was told out of order. It was told in parts, and it was done so on purpose to build suspense so that the vital piece of information could be given to you kind of at the last moment. Think about the last few lines of An Occurrence at Owl Creek Bridge. Not until that very end figure out, oh, everything that's happened now makes sense. We now understand what this means and the truth of it all. Also, the story is told in a bit of a stream of consciousness narration, meaning that the writing mimics the flow of characters' thoughts. And just like a person's thought, that writing could be organized, it could be chaotic, it could be factual, or it could be exaggerated, it could be a lie, it could be misremembered. In some cases, authors who use stream of consciousness narration are trying to capture the chaotic nature of a person's thought as it passes through their head. I mean, think about your own ability to focus on a thing and to have clarity of thought. Often you have other things that are coming into your mind at any given time. If you can imagine what would happen if someone recorded those thoughts and wrote them down, it might be kind of hard to follow your train of thought. Fortunately, Faulkner gives us a form of stream of consciousness narration that's fairly easy to follow. It's fairly straightforward. You're not going to find yourself hearing distracting thoughts and bold-faced lies in the story. But the fact that it is different people's thoughts should clue you into the fact that you may not be getting the ultimate truth. You may be getting some exaggerations. You are getting kind of an old South style of storytelling that's all about big characters and big events, which may stretch the truth a little bit. And lastly, the story may even feature multiple narrators. Those 5 parts that the story is told in may actually be 5 different people. And once you get the last bit of information, you may see how all of those different narrators fit together. Finally, some big ideas that I want you to be thinking about as you read this story. One of the first ones is tradition versus progress. how do these characters, how does Miss Emily deal with the inevitable marching forward of time as the world changes around her and she clings to an old version of the place where she grew up, an old version of the world as she sees it. Also, the story deals with the idea of patriarchy. Now, this is a society that is run by men for the benefit of men. And where does a person like Miss Emily, who is a woman, fit into that? Where does she find her power? The story also deals with ideas of class, including what it means to adhere to class norms, the rules of behavior that apply to different people. People in upper class have to behave a certain way. Emily Grierson is a part of that upper class. And also there's a separation between these classes. People who are in the upper class, if they're adhering to those norms properly, often don't associate with people who are in lower classes. And then lastly, and this is a really big one, is the idea of personal tragedy and trauma. Emily Grierson is someone who has experienced deep loss and has been traumatized by it. And you'll see how she responds to that and how all of these big ideas come together to create a situation where you can almost understand why this crazy old lady acts the way that she does. I hope that as you're reading this story this week that you find it enjoyable, that you find it surprising, that you take the time to think about how some of these big ideas reflect us as human beings nowadays in the time that we're in. And we'll get together and talk about that very soon. Good luck. Have fun. What a time to be alive.